Let's hear some music!
I don't know. You have to understand this was pre-Wayne's World, pre-Mystery Science Theater, pre-Comedy Central, pre-Jackass, pre-any sort of gonzo entertainment that now exists. And I mean, YouTube, come on. Had someone tried to explain what the fuck a YouTube would be in 1989 to a couple punks sitting around in the middle of Kentucky watching bad movies, we would have looked at them, eyes glazed over, drooling, before we slapped them in the face with a fucking VHS tape and screamed about how Blockbuster Video was running the drive-in out of business. I mean, normal people couldn't make a TV show. There was no system for it. So we used what we had. Some cheap cameras, a really terrible public access channel, and the balls to try it. And a lot of beer.
I'm George Moranville, a.k.a. Brother George, and I was a co-host on the show Brains on Film.
Or the town drunk.
Oh, I had to grab me a bisque.
I'm gonna be falling on my face, man.
Brains on Film was our way of discussing movies that sometimes people didn't discuss, or movies that people discussed, but they discussed them in the wrong way. And I'm sort of the pretentious side of that by my own admission as far as the show goes.
This is the harbinger of the modern day horror film. I mean, the 50s had kind of the anti-communist kind of themes with the black and white films of invasion of you know,
whatever,
red.
the doo-doo heads, whatever.
Right. In the 60s, we had kind of a dual thing. We had the Corman films, which were, you know, ours. We could thankfully say that we own Roger Corman, that America does. We also had the Hammer films from Europe. But the 70s, when the 70s came in, this film just blew people away.
That's right.
My role was to overanalyze, which I'm guilty as charged, on films, no matter whether they were pretentious films that we were trying to dumb down or whether they were dumb films we were trying to show the strong points of.
I am the product of a lifetime of a fanboy who showed horror movies in his mother's sewing room on 8mm Hammer horror movies. To present day, I am the professor who teaches a horror seminar at the University of Kentucky. Susan Sontag had written the essay, Notes on Camp. Quentin Tarantino hadn't come along yet, and there was still this sort of nervous tension between high art and low art, or the brows, as I call them, highbrow, middle brow, low brow, unibrow.
Anyway.
I guess we'll drop a clip in there.
Yeah.
The crowd would gather at the temple for the great feast, the blood feast that would give the goddess to the people. The young priestesses would be slaughtered on the great altar. Their blood would be caught in silver bowls as it ran from their bodies. Then certain organs and limbs would be removed and prepared as dishes to serve the people.
Oh, keep talking to me, Fuad.
I'm Larry Joe Treadway, and in Brains on Film, I played a guy very similar to myself, known as Professor Tread.
Contemporary hero of Brother George.
As I was saying, I'm not going to go out on a tangent.
I guess my love of like bad movies probably goes back first of all to like the idea of bad movies, because before I actually probably saw a horror movie in the real sense, I saw Famous Monsters magazine, Castle of Frankenstein, Creepy, those kind of things at like the drugstores in Georgetown, Kentucky. Georgetown, Kentucky, which 15 miles from Lexington, but in like the 60s and 70s, it could have been 100 miles because totally repressed. The Baptist College ran the whole town. There had once been a downtown movie theater. It went out of business because the college didn't like the kind of movies that were shown. The drive-ins were 15 miles away at the time in Lexington. And we'd make regular trips on the weekends to see whatever was popular. Sometimes things that weren't popular or inappropriate. Like me and my cousins, we got piled in the car with my mom, and we go to the family drive-in, which was up on New Circle Road. There was the Circle 25, and across the street was the family. We went to the family one weeknight during the summer, and it was a film called Dirty O'Neill, which I'm sure was a Dirty Harry ripoff, Clint Eastwood ripoff. And of course the opening scene is they're at this, I think, a police officer's birthday party, and then they wheel out, a big tiered cake, and a totally naked girl jumps out of the top, and the camera goes to full on, as close up to bouncing boobs as you could ever get. And it was me and my cousin were just okay, drive-ins are the greatest thing ever in the history of the world. And that kind of stuck.
As a cultural and a social event where all my friends would get together, we were all in graduate school in English. And this is another thing about the cultural anxiety, because I'm trying to study film as art, but I love film as shit too. And I'm trying to pull these things together and the way that they intersect. And it was almost like on Saturday, in antediluvian time, when if you wanted to watch something, you had to be there when it was aired. And if you didn't, you missed it, which is something I don't think younger people will ever even understand growing up under those kind of the discipline of that. And we'd get together every Saturday morning at 9:00 to watch Pee-wee's Playhouse. And we'd get together whenever it was. It was a little more erratic on local access, but we'd find out when the thing was on, and we'd be there for it, and we'd build kind of a party around it, and we'd integrate it into our culture. That's another important thing about it. I think it wasn't something that was inaccessible. It was just a bunch of schmoes just like you. And so when they were sneering at stuff, we could sneer at them, and off in the heavens somewhere, Jack Kerouac's sneering at all of us. And it's a big sneerathon all around. As with many things, Brains on Films was prescient, I think, of the culture and the technology to come and the way those intersect.
Or
it's like a forerunner of what people are doing on YouTube all the time. Viral culture. It's like technology in general. I used to think that Brains on Film was like Videodrome, that it was like this sort of toxic systemic virus which was transmitted through the public access channel. And if that's the case, then maybe it led to YouTube.
I know this sounds incredibly pretentious, but George and I were always ahead of what was getting ready to happen. Whether it was with Brains on Film and public access, which eventually became streaming audio and video, or whether it was Film Cynics and the radio show being kind of the precursor to podcast. If anything, we were almost too informed for our own good. We were out there pushing the envelope and breaking the ground. We suffer for being, premature ejaculators.
It was the best time I've ever had. Brains on Film was the most creative I've ever felt because it happened spontaneously. It didn't happen with a sense of what anybody else was going to say about editing it or cutting it apart. We didn't really care. And that was, I think, what Tread and I were doing with everything we did, which was the band, whether it was the band or whether it was this show. Definitely, it was the best, most free I ever felt with regard to expressing myself.
I think it's crucial when you're talking about cult phenomena to think about how self-conscious the artifact is. By which I mean that I don't think a couple of rich young film school graduates can make a cult film deliberately. A cult film needs to be accidental. To really be cult, it needs to fail, which also fits in with the punk rock aesthetic, which I think is this weird sort of reverse snobbery at some point, which is if your band gets big enough to get outside of your brother's garage, then you've sold out. And I'm proud to say that Brains on Film never suffered that embarrassment. It failed flat out, and it failed to the extent that it's a great thing. There's a wonderful legacy to it that way. You need to fail on your own terms.